Elden Ring is a story full of dualities, a world that exists in balance between opposing forces, life and death being one of the primary examples of this in the base game, but the shadow of the Erdtree DLC brought the idea of light and dark to the forefront, with the Shadow Tree being the vessel for all things not governed by the Erdtree, including the dark. But nowhere is the idea of light and dark more clearly seen than in the story of Messmer and his Abyssal Serpent. So in this lore video we will examine Messmer, the base serpent. Messmer's curse is something we witness during stage 2 of his fight, when he becomes one with the base serpent that is contained within him. The Abyssal Serpent is a creature that was sealed behind his eye by his mother, Marika, as his remembrance reads the following. A malevolent snake writhed within Messmer, and so his very mother plucked out his eye and put in its place a seal of grace. Indeed, Messmer's eye is essentially the same model as Marika's rune, indicating that Marika's power is somehow keeping this Abyssal Serpent in place in his eye socket. In stage 2, when Messmer plucks out this eye and shatters it, it breaks into golden flakes, reinforcing the fact that this is not an eye at all, but is instead an artifact constructed entirely of grace. And this is the first indication that the power of the Abyss, or Dark, is an opposing force to grace. The Abyssal Serpent is a fascinating subject because it brings the importance of the Dark to the forefront of Elden Ring's lore. When talking about the Abyss in this chapter, there are two things I hope you'll get from it. The first is that the Abyss represents the Dark, and that the Dark is an opposing force to light and grace. And while the relationship between light and dark is more front and centre in Dark Souls, it is still very much present in Elden Ring, especially now in this DLC. The second point I hope you'll take away is that the Abyss is often related to the cosmos, the dark void of space, and in Elden Ring this is the domain of the celestial and the cosmic. There isn't much in-game lore that talks directly about the Abyssal Serpent. However, Messmer does say something of this serpent during Stage 2's transition.
I will not suffer. A lord devoid of light. No mother. Forgive me. Soon tarnished. Wilt thou be taken in the jaws of the Abyssal Serpent, shorn of light.
This is the Abyssal Serpent shorn of light, meaning cut off from light, already emphasizing the role that the Abyss plays in Elden Ring's lore as the opposite of light. It is the bottomless dark, entirely absent of light. The Abyss and Serpents isn't something new to FromSoftware. The Abyss was a major component of Dark Souls lore, with us first being introduced to it via Kath, the primordial serpent. The Abyss of Dark Souls is a massive lore subject in of itself, so excuse me while I reduce it to its most basic lore points for the purposes of this video. The Dark Souls world was once one of uniformity, a grey world where everything was the same. Then there was the advent of fire, a cosmic event that upended the rules of the universe, and the universe became one of duality and disparity. Life and death, heat and cold, light and dark. At the beginning of the Age of Fire, 4 great souls were found within the flame, 2 pairs of opposites, the soul of chaos, i.e. life, and the soul of death, making up 1 pair, and then there is the soul of light and the soul of dark. The Abyss is essentially a consequence of light and a manifestation of the dark. All of this to say is that the Abyss in Dark Souls is incredibly complicated, and there is a lot of symbolic meaning that you can draw from it. However, some of the most interesting and important ties are its opposing nature to light, and its natural tie to the abyss of space. The void of space itself is a dark plane of existence that is absent light, and is often referred to as the abyss. And as we look at the Abyssal Serpent further in this chapter, I think you'll find that these are the most relevant allusions that we can get from the abyss in Elden Ring as well. Fellow content creator Max Derat did an excellent video recently, which clearly illustrates the symbology behind the Abyssal Serpent. Max brings up alchemy, and how the idea of reconciling opposite halves, usually represented by red and white, is a concept often repeated in FromSoftware games, but even more so in Elden Ring, with the idea of Marika and Radagon. The White Queen and the Red King merge together to form the Rebus, the personification of the Philosopher's Stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy. This symbolic illusion is something that has been well discussed on my channel and others at this point. However, Max brings up something else, and that is the bonding agent that is needed to bring these two halves together. And this is the god Mercurius. Mercurius is represented in many different ways, and in his video Max gives two main examples of the way Mercurius is portrayed. One being the void or space, and two being two intertwining snakes, or the caduceus. And of course, in both Elden Ring and in Dark Souls now, we have a snake and the abyss associated together in regards to the force of darkness, leaving us in no doubt the source of inspiration for FromSoftware's depiction of the abyss in both games, and it helps explain why snakes and the abyss go together in both of these games. And the way that Max describes the cosmos or the void from an alchemical standpoint is very interesting as well. He describes it as the base material that binds everything together. Hence we have the base serpent of Messmer. Again, I would recommend Max's deep dive in full, as it's truly fascinating, but I just wanted to highlight the thematic and symbolic underpinnings of the Abyssal Serpent as a starting point for our discussion. While the Abyss does occupy its own lore in-game, it is undeniable that we are meant to think of the void and dark expanse of space, especially when we consider that even in the base game of Elden Ring, there are references to the Abyss and darkness already that are tied to the cosmos and the celestial beings within. Indeed, the lore surrounding Astel, a living malformed star, often refers to the cosmos in a similar manner. Fellow content creator and translator Last Protagonist even suggests that the original Japanese for Astel should be translated as Astel, spawn of darkness, rather than natural born of the void, which serves to highlight this connection between space and darkness. Indeed, if you use Astel's remembrance, you can create waves of darkness, an ash of war, the powers of the void manifesting as dark energy. And this is an attack that Astel can use himself as well, again connecting the celestial to the darkness and the abyss. The specific term abyss is actually used once in the base game of Elden Ring as well, and that is in Comet Azure, in reference to Azure peering through the primeval current and into the abyss of space. And now in the DLC we get further ties between the abyss and this concept of darkness. We find this in the Sword Hands of Night, for example, and the two that we meet in game are Yolan and Anna. Emir is their master, and is a thinker of Carian origin, who thinks deeply on the cosmos and its relation to the greater will. Thus his greatest weapons are a reflection of the dark cosmos, of the abyss, the dark of space absent light. For example, Yolan and Anna's ash read the following: "Together, Yolan's swords and Anna's claws are as bottomless black, and penetrate the enemy's guard. Yolan and Anna were born in a cold, dark jail, where they were raised, deprived of light, to be Sword Hands of Night." Everything about these two is meant to reflect a dark, absent of light, essentially the abyss of space. Their weapons are bottomless black, and like space, the weapons are incorporeal, and thus pass through shields and blocks. Anna and Yolan were even raised in a jail to be deprived of light, to reflect that darkness of the cosmos. All of this to say is that there are elements of Elden Ring that touch on this idea of an abyss that is often related to the cosmic realm, and to inhuman entities that exist outside of our terrestrial realm. However, unlike the other references to the abyss or cosmos which focus on the beings that exist within this void, the Abyssal Serpent seems to be a manifestation of that darkness itself. Perhaps then this is enough for us to go on. Perhaps the Abyssal Serpent is just another cosmic being, an outer god of the void, or the vassal of an outer god. Malenia has the scarlet rot within her, the influence of an outer god, and thus it is possible that Messmer, another demigod of the same lineage, also caught the attention of some creature of an outer god, and as such it took root within him, like a parasite, a tapeworm of unfathomable power that has been with him since his birth. The serpent is cosmic in its behaviours. Behind Messmer's eye there is a dark void, an abyss that seems to go deeper than is physically possible within his head. You can see the snake coiled within his eye, and yet when the serpent manifests fully, it is massive. So while the base serpent inhabits a relatively small space within Messmer's eye socket, clearly there are some spatial anomalies at play here, pointing to the fact that this is a cosmic creature beyond the normal rules of the terrestrial realm. The aesthetic choices for the serpent also line up somewhat with the elements of Dark Souls, again perhaps implying it has a similar nature to the Abyss of that game. We can see red eyes that line its body, and when it summons duplicates they too have these multiple red eyes. And these multiple red eyes remind me of Manus and the Ulasil residence. Much like Dark was the opposing force of light in Dark Souls, I think the DLC really reinforces the opposing forces of light and dark as well, with Grace, the Erdtree, and other things relating to the Greater Will being the representatives of light, life, and order, whereas on the other side we have things such as dark, disorder, and chaos. I felt like the base game focused more on the differences between life and death, with the removal of the Rune of Death and the Place of Death being a major focus of the base game's lore. But the remembrance of the Scadutree avatar makes it clear that everything contrary to the Erdtree is reflected and contained within the Scadutree and the Realm of Shadow, as it reads, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle." Dark notions that bear no sense of order is a very interesting use of words. The Erdtree, Elden Ring, and Greater Will are often associated with order, everything gold essentially. The Elden Beast's remembrance even tells us that the Beast and Elden Ring were the embodiment of order. In each of the Elden Lord endings, we repair the Elden Ring and bring about a new age. The configuration of the Elden Ring can be very different in each variant, but one thing unites them: we bring order back to the world. Indeed, in symbology, dark is often associated with disorder and chaos, whereas light is often associated with order and structure, as it is in the system of yin and yang, and as it was in Dark Souls. All of that to say is that dark really is a force in the cosmic rules of Elden Ring, and it is partially represented and contained by the Scadutree, given it is the shadow or dark of the Erdtree, which is the light to the world. And there is another display of the power of the dark in the DLC that we can potentially tie to the Scadutree, and I'm referring to the obscuring of Anir Elim by the Sealing Tree, which seems to coat the tower in dark. We know from Empyrean Grandam's dialogue that it was Marika's people who sealed the tower in shadow.
"Our lands were by thy kind set aflame, our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow."
Shadow is essentially the power of obscuring, of hiding things from the light. But how are they able to do this? Well, a Twitter user called Liam Hawes reached out to me and made a really interesting observation that I really like. The Sealing Tree is actually the same shape of half of the Scadutree. To me, the implication is clear. Marika's followers used the dark power within the Scadutree to obscure the tower. The Scadutree is the vessel for dark and shadow, thus it is these powers that are being utilised here. In the DLC we start to get further emphasis on the Erdtree and Grace's relation to light, mainly through Sir Messmer's dogma and dialogue. When he recognises that we, Marika's Lord-elect, is a tarnished, he reacts with surprise.
"That tarnished, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light?"
The way in which he describes us here is very interesting. Not bereft of grace, but bereft of light. he sees grace and the lack of it in terms of light and dark, and it might not be too surprising that he thinks of it in this way, given the darkness that he has within himself. Indeed, this does seem to be reinforced by his lines should he kill you in stage 2 of his fight.
O lightless creature, embrace thine oblivion, as shall I.
Perhaps his grace purity dogma is one born of self-hatred for the lightless void that exists within him, being an opposite force to grace. Indeed, further evidence that the Abyss stands in opposition to grace and the Erdtree is the very fact that Marika's seal of grace is successful in holding back the serpent. Her light holds back the Abyss within Messmer, and there are hints that this opposing duality of light and dark goes further back than even the Erdtree. We can find the swords of darkness and light within this new DLC. The base variant of these swords, the stone-sheathed sword, tells us that this is an artifact of an ancient civilization, and given Ra lies within these lands, and one of the altars, the Altar of Light, is found there, it must be a remnant of that civilization. Thus, the representation of light and dark predates the Erdtree, given Ra was an ancient civilization. It's just that the Erdtree is the most recent representation of order, light, and life. But dark and light has always existed in the world of Elden Ring. I therefore find it fascinating that the DLC focuses so heavily on this concept, and ultimately I see the serpent as a manifestation of darkness and the void, a cosmic being that draws on the power of darkness, and until now has been held back by the power of grace and light. The next thing I want to talk about is how the Abyssal Serpent affected Messmer's flame. In Messmer's kindling, it calls his flame a dark thing that has been eaten away by the Abyssal Serpent. We have talked in detail in the previous chapter about the power of the dark that exists within Elden Ring, and that the Abyssal Serpent is a coalescence of that power. And as such, it's no surprise that the fire within Messmer has also been afflicted by the Abyss, by the dark of this serpent. And this is why it's got a slightly dark colouring to it, and it's why Messmer's flame can be used for other things like necromancy, a fact we'll get into in the next chapter. Additionally, the serpent's relationship to Messmer's flame can be seen in the way that it manifests. The flame spreads out, coils and moves like a serpent, with the ember of Messmer even being described as taking a serpentine form. This just really emphasises the sheer power of this creature that's within Messmer. It has made his flame truly unique, dark and serpentine in nature. Messmer's orb tells us how Messmer despised his own flame, and I initially assumed this was just because of how fire is viewed within Erdtree society, given the burning of the Erdtree is viewed as the first cardinal sin, and fire in general is viewed unfavourably. However, on reflection, and after writing this past chapter on the Abyssal Serpent, I can't help but think the reason Messmer hated his fire so much was because it would always be a reminder of the darkness that lies within him, the blasphemous abyss. The parasitic nature of the serpent is also illustrated in the way that it and Messmer seem to become one when the seal of grace is removed. After all, in the second phase he is called Base Serpent Messmer. They are one being. They move as one, with the Abyssal Serpent sometimes taking control before ceding it back to Messmer. Messmer's orb is one of his signature moves in stage 1. It's the one he opens with usually, where he dives into the air before bringing an orb down upon the enemy. However, in stage 2, the Abyssal Serpent also opens with this move, before the Abyssal Serpent melts away and Messmer is left standing there. They are one and the same. If you look carefully at the Abyssal Serpent, you will see that it is missing an eye. And the reason it's missing an eye is because Messmer is now also missing an eye. They are one and the same being in this stage 2. And I want to shout out Bonfire VN, because if not for Bonfire's excellent Messmer video, I may not have noticed these details, and that video will be linked below and I highly recommend you watch it. There are other signs of how they are one and the same. If you look at the serpent's body, you can see Messmer's red hair all over its body. And in stage 2, Messmer's skin has become mottled like the snake skin. It has possessed his body. They are not fighting alongside each other. They are one. This is what Marika has prevented all these years with the power of grace and light. The Abyssal Serpent was there, yes, but it didn't take over Messmer. The power of light held back the dark from consuming Messmer entirely, although it did eat away at his flame. No wonder the Horn-Sent gets such sadistic pleasure in seeing the nightmare of his people reduced so.
Upon his end, did you see Messmer's face? 'Twas sublime. A very tangle of snakes. To think he dared call us savages, when he himself was most base of all.
Now that we've talked about the abyssal aspect of the base serpent, there are some further observations I want to make about serpents in general. And the first are how Messmer's winged serpents play into all of this. I find the winged serpent helm a good place to start, as it reads the following. Helm of Kud, Captain of the Fire Knights. A winged serpent perches atop it. The winged serpent is a token creature of Messmer's military forces. It is a wise friend, which keeps the base serpent at bay and holds its power in check. These serpents do not seem to be connected to the base serpents. They are companions of Messmer's, wrapped around his body, and are somehow able to help him resist the power of the Abyssal Serpent. Additionally, they may also play another role by acting as his eyes. When we first enter the room, it is one of the serpents that studies us, and Messmer almost seems to see through its eyes that we are tarnished. This would make sense, given his mother has seemed to have plucked out his only eye and replaced it with a seal of grace. In the second stage, he is definitely blind, given his seal of grace has been removed. However, whether he's seeing through his winged serpents or the Abyssal Serpent at this stage is unknown. Whatever purpose the winged serpents serve, they are not part of the base serpent, and in fact, they seem to suffer with Messmer when he releases the Abyssal Serpent. We see them charred by the black flame as well, and they turn from red to white. And Messmer's helm reads the following. They were there when the base serpent was sealed behind his eye. They were there through his eternity of suffering. They will accompany him yet in his hideous new form, born when he destroyed the grace granted by his mother. They have accepted his fate as much as he. With that said, I want to go back to the description of the winged serpent helm, as there are a couple of other things to note here. The description tells us that it's the token creature of Messmer's military forces, and explains the serpent imagery used by his forces. And this opens up an interesting discussion around serpents in general, because we know the serpents were viewed as negative within Erdtree society. So how did Messmer's forces get away with adorning themselves with serpents? We know from Black Knight Commander Andreas's ashes that he and his son Hugh, and others, rebelled against Messmer after learning about his serpentine nature. And this must have been the Abyssal Serpent. His troops must have been fine with his winged serpents that he kept as companions. After all, they were ultimately the sigil that he chose to bear as his coat of arms and the symbol of his military forces, so this wasn't the reason that Hugh and Andreas chose to rebel. It must have been discovering the nature of the base serpent within Messmer. After all, let us not forget the Serpent Crest shield, a shield meant to commemorate the crusade that proudly and overtly sports the serpent upon it. The winged serpents are accepted and even adorned by his troops. Prior to release, I did a lore preview video, which was based on my 3 hours with the game that I got to play before launch, and it was semi-speculative based on the lore I was able to uncover in those 3 hours in the early areas of the game. One of the items I had access to in that preview was Black Knight Andreas's ashes, and I meditated on the meaning of this description without having further context of the rest of the DLC. I reflected that the wording around Andreas's reason for rebelling about Messmer's serpentine nature must have meant that the serpent was already viewed as something negative within Erdtree society. We know that gladiatorial games used to be held in the great arenas of Leyndell and elsewhere in the lands between, and that the serpent was the object of ire within these games. For example, the Duelist Helm reads the following. Bronze helm decorated with innumerable snakes, worn by gladiators who were driven from the Colosseum. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing these bronze effigies beaten and battered. So at some stage, the hatred for snakes was established in Erdtree society, to the point that they were routinely and ritually humiliated in the arenas. Much like in the UK, every November 5th, people burn effigies of Guy Fawkes on bonfires. So in the past 2 years of lore study, myself and others have ruminated on what event could have led to this. Why are serpents considered traitors to the Erdtree? Bearing in mind that the word traitor means they were once aligned with the Erdtree, but somehow betrayed their trust. And now we have to reconcile that lore with how Messmer, a demigod son of the royal family of the Erdtree, was able to wear serpents proudly upon his coat of arms. Tarnished Archaeologist made a compelling argument in a video that the serpent may have been involved with the Glomide Queen, given the presence of a godskin noble at the Temple of Iglay, the temple dedicated to the Great Serpent, and the serpentine nature of the godskins as well. If the serpent Iglay was allied to the godskins and the Glomide Queen, it could explain why they were considered a traitor to the Erdtree. Tim Diggity in a really interesting video went even further, suggesting that the Glomide Queen may well have been a serpent themselves, and I encourage you to watch both of these excellent videos, which will be linked below. Whatever the reason you believe that the serpents were viewed as negative by the Erdtree society, we need to somehow explain how Messmer was able to take the serpent as his symbol in a time like this. Consider the wording of Andreas's ashes. This is someone who's clearly loyal to Messmer, even choosing to leave the Erdtree with Messmer, and by this time Messmer will clearly have been having the snake as his sigil. So why is this not a problem for Andreas, yet his serpentine nature is? If the serpent was already hated by the time the crusade happened, how do we explain people giving up so much to join Messmer's side? Well, there are a few possibilities to consider. The first is the most simple one, and that is that Messmer taking the treasonous serpent as his sigil was seen as acceptable, as it's merely a fearsome choice for a coat of arms. A simple but not particularly satisfying explanation, to be sure. Another explanation is that the serpent was indeed already viewed with suspicion, and Messmer chose it nonetheless, opening himself up to public criticism. One of the lore items that I find very interesting in the DLC is the Fire Knight Helm, as it reads the following. Each and every knight hailed from a renowned family of the Erdtree's upper echelons, but were shunned and chased from their homes after pledging allegiance to Messmer as their master. This straight up tells us that those who chose to align themselves with Messmer were immediately disdained, becoming excluded from the Erdtree society's upper echelons, and perhaps a large part of this was because of Messmer's coat of arms. As we will discuss in the coming chapters, it seems as though Messmer willingly took on the role of the Impaler in order to take the blame for his mother's machinations. His armour set reads the following. Black armour of Messmer the Impaler, draped with a red cloak bearing his crest embroidered. On his mother's wishes, Messmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the cleansing crusade she desired. Direct thy maledictions, thine ire, and thy grief towards me alone. Firstly, it tells us that Messmer became this symbol of fear on his mother's wishes. He stylized himself as the Impaler, and became this great villain on her orders. Additionally, it has a quote from him that implies Messmer is wanting those who may hate the crusade and its actions to direct their hatred towards him alone. In my full story summary video, I suggested that the reason that those who follow Messmer were shunned was because Marika publicly distanced herself from the crusade and allowed Messmer and his followers to take public blame for such a controversial and brutal campaign, despite the fact she in reality ordered Messmer to do this. A political move that her son readily agreed to, and perhaps his brazen taking of the serpent as his sigil was just a further calculation to draw criticism away from his mother and towards himself. I think it would have been nice if we would have been able to see Messmer as the reason that the serpent is viewed as a traitor, as this would all line up nicely with what I've just said, that he was publicly blamed for this crusade, and thus he could have been denounced as a traitor, and at that point going forward the serpent, his sigil, would have been seen as treasonous to the Erdtree. However, unfortunately, it seems like the timeline wouldn't line up with this. I've already discussed the fact that the serpent was beaten in the arenas, and this was a practice that was really under Godfrey. And by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, these practices had all but died out. And as I will suggest in the later chapters, I think Messmer's crusade took place after the Liurnian Wars and after Radagon's marriage to Rennala, and in fact, it may have been after Godfrey and his Tarnished were banished from the lands between, because Messmer knows what a Tarnished is. And if the arenas were closed down by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, this would leave a very small gap between when Godfrey was banished and when Radagon became Elden Lord for Messmer to go on his crusade and give serpents their bad name, so they were used as effigies in the arena. It just doesn't quite line up as neatly as I'd want it to. However, it is definitely possible that Messmer is the reason they are viewed as traitors, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. There are a few other loose ends regarding serpents that I want to talk about in this chapter before we move on to the crusade proper. The first is a bit of a mystery that was discovered by various Twitter users, and it was first brought to my attention by user Messy Hair, and thank you so much for tagging me in this, as I had genuinely not noticed this. Messy Hair shared a screenshot of something interesting that can be found near Bonnie Village, a giant snakeskin. What are we to make of this relic? It is too big to be one of the winged serpents of Messmer, and yet I agree with Messy Hair's assessment that we are to somehow connect this to Messmer. Nearby you can find the O Mother gesture, and the term O Mother is one that Messmer explicitly uses in the Stage 2 cinematic of his boss fight. So did Messmer shed this skin? It is possible that this skin was shed by his Abyssal Serpent, as the size isn't too much of a mismatch, and that is definitely the simplest explanation. However, one can't help but notice it's a very similar model to that of Iglay, the god-devouring serpent of Rykard, and in fact the skin is almost the same model as the skin you can find in the Temple of Iglay. Did this Abyssal Serpent of Messmer once give birth to Iglay, or are they connected? I can certainly see this Abyssal Serpent somehow being tied to all serpents, but I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smowtown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.